leadership in the UK. Remain is the founder and CEO of Diversify, which is an organisation that looks to helping balance out equalities and looking at supporting those from ethnic minorities and making sure that I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that. Apologies for narratives. It's in lowercase. I think when I converted it changed it. But yeah, it does give it gives a bit of a different feel. But yeah, thank you for your introduction. I'd like to thank everyone from PEM Finance for corporate finance for inviting me over. Just out of interest, am I supposed to look this way or what's the?
It's up to you.
Okay.
So if you want to address the 63 people, then look towards the camera.
Okay.
If you want to address the room,
fine. Perfect. I'll do a bit of both.
Yeah.
Well, I hope everyone's having a fantastic start to Black History Month. We're day 4 now. The week's moving very, very quickly. But before we start, I'd like us to start by really trying to confront our ideas about history. So much of what we understand about history, our ideas about history, are bound up in our emotions. We form emotional connections to places in history, to people in history, to narratives in history that aren't always supported by the evidence. And we then look for the evidence to support our narrative rather than allowing the evidence to drive our narrative. And I think that in itself has been quite problematic in its origin. In terms of this month, I'd like us all to use the month as an opportunity to unlearn and relearn things that we may or may not have heard before, things that might make us feel quite uncomfortable because it's the new, it's not the norm, it's a contrary type of narrative. And I'd like us to really try and open our minds because that's what history is all about. It's about using knowledge as an opportunity to open our minds and redefine narratives. And this is what this lecture or this presentation, I should say, is about. It's about redefining narratives and celebrating the history of Black leadership in the UK. And this is a fantastic painting, early 16th century painting of somewhat of a Moor. And we'll get into in shortly what a Moor actually means. It is, yes. I think it's this. Yes, perfect. Clicker is working as well, guys. Fantastic.
What a day.
Right, so this is the agenda for today. We're going to be looking at the intro, which I'm going to move on to shortly. Then we look at the early Black presence in the UK, the abolitionist movement, the Victorian era to World Wars, post-World War II and the Windrush generation, the civil rights movement and activism. Yes, there was a civil rights movement in the UK. It wasn't just a USA phenomenon. Contemporary Black leadership, challenges and progress, and conclusion. So this slide, it's a slide of terminology, and I wanted to put it in because I really wanted to challenge our concepts of these terms, black and white. So the terms black and white don't actually denote real skin color. No one is actually white, and no one is actually purely black. Some people, like myself, have melanin, and we have a rich, dark brown skin complexion, but no one is actually this pigmentation. No one is actually black. These are terms of art. Okay, they're used to denote artwork. They're not actually used to denote skin color, and they're a politically, socially driven type of terms. And we may choose to reclaim these terms, or we may choose to do away with these terms and use something completely different. It's up to us. But I just wanted to start by analysis of these terms and understand why in some cases, some instances, they're quite problematic. Another thing with these terms is when we're looking at specifically around the medieval and the early modern period of the period that we're looking at, these terms weren't really commonly used. They were terms like the blackamoors or Moors, or even a Spanish term which had the origins in a word called nigars. That was used. A term called Saracens was also used, Garamantes. These were the terms that we find in this period used, and not black and white. And the reason why I say that is because I'm going to be talking about some of these terms. I'm going to be mentioning Saracens. I'm going to be mentioning Moors. And for the purposes of understanding, as why I might be describing someone as a Moor as opposed to a black person. It's just because these terms are modern, or in some ways modern constructions. These were terms that were fueled by people like Frederick Blumenbach, and the pseudo-scientific origins of where race came from. And these were also ideas that Charles Darwin um, later took on in his works. So next slide. Okay, very interesting picture. You may be asking, why does in a presentation about Black history and Black leadership, why do I have this picture, this image? The reason why I have this image is because when we think about British history, when we're in schools, when we're in primary school, secondary schools, college, or whatever, when we think about Black history, we think about these pictures, we think about these monarchs, we think about these people. These are the people that are supposed to represent the definitive age that they were monarchs in. When we look at the Tudor age, King Henry VIII, top second picture, he is supposed to represent what the Tudor age at that particular period of time looked like. But we know from, if we look at, for example, and we'll come on to this, we look at if we look at all these images, we know that they don't actually represent the definitive age. They don't represent the small people, the normal people, the regular people. They only represent one particular strata of society. And we'll look into that and we'll get into it in a bit more detail. But I just wanted us to, when we look at these images, start to question our perceptions of these particular periods of time. Just like if we look at Queen Elizabeth, the last was our last reigning monarch, rest in peace. When we look at this image here, I'm not sure if my laser would work here. Okay, it doesn't work here, but it works here. If we look at this image here, okay, as like the image of King Henry VIII, if that image was showed to us and we didn't know, maybe say 1,000 years from now, okay, and this image here was shown to us, that image would be shown to be the definitive image of that age. But we know that that was a period of time. We all lived in this period of time where Britain was very diverse, where Britain had to confront a number of different facts in terms of losing her empire and a number of different issues happening in this particular period of time. So just as this particular period of time isn't homogenous ethnically, isn't homogenous racially, religiously, and all the other socially, politically, it's not homogenous, we shouldn't assume then that the other periods of time were homogenous also. History is a continuation. It's not a monolithic thing that just is stagnant. There is much continuation, and we're going to see this in the next couple of slides. Okay, very, very famous quote by someone called, these people, Venerable Bede, he was a priest in the 7th century, Richard Cirencester, Francis Bacon, very, very learned people in their age. They all said something very, very similar, or added upon or regurgitated this particular quote here. The quote says, the original inhabitants of Britannia, yes, I know you can all read, but I'm just going to read it out for the purposes of this presentation. The quote says, the original inhabitants of Britannia, whether indigenous or foreign, are like most other countries, unknown. So what that means is that these respectable and learned people within a 1,000-year period from the 7th century to the 17th century are all given an analysis of what they think or who they think the original inhabitants of this country were and are, and they don't know. They're all saying, we don't know who they are, meaning that potentially it wasn't them. And this is just, not trying to rustle feathers here, but I think, like I mentioned earlier, history is about looking at alternative narratives, things that we haven't heard before, that will make us question and challenge potentially our own biases and potentially things that we may think we know, but maybe we don't know. So this is a very, very interesting quote that is indicative of that. So what has been the narrative when it comes to Black people in the UK? What has been the narrative? There's been two strands of narratives. One has been around Windrush. Okay, Windrush is a period of time, very important period of time that my grandma came to the UK. Is a period of time from 1948 to 1971. Okay, the first narrative is that the majority of black people or the black presence first in the UK first started in Windrush, so as a 1948 phenomenon. That's the first narrative, or that the first narrative has been. The second narrative is slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. And that narrative basically says that black people in the UK, if they were here before Windrush, it was only through the myopia of automatic enslavement, which would be the measure of the presence of black people or people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa. So, in simple terms, that if a black person was to be in the UK in the 15th century, in the 13th century, in the 16th century, for example, 18th century, they would have been automatically a slave. And my research has been in my research, but also this presentation, is to really challenge those ideas because I think they're very reductionist and they are limiting said group of peoples. Next slide. So these are some of the terminologies when we look at what academics have written, and we'll move on to that shortly. These are some of the terms or phrases or words that have been used to describe black people in the UK, their presence here, and their experiences here. So these are some of the words: the stranger, isolated, chance visitors, solitary, the other, when imported. So we have that whole slave element again, transient or accidental. Accidental is a really funny one. It always gets me. I don't think anything is accidental, but that's but that's a different story. The next slide. So look, this is so here is some of the words and the terminologies and the phrases. Here is them in their sort of longer form. So Kenneth Little, which is a book 1947 called Negroes in Britain, Kenneth doubts if the black man, whether African or East African, was a familiar figure until well on in the 16th century. Basically saying there was no black people here before the 16th century, unless as a chance visitor, obviously we have this chance visitor thing again, or when imported by the Portuguese in the colonial territories. Okay. We have Peter Fryer, Peter Fryer called, and he has a book called Staying Power. Very, very good book. And I have it at home. And I recommend you get it and you read it. It's very good in other ways. But one of the things he says, and he continues that narrative from Kenneth Little, and he says that Africans in England were strolling players, isolated, strange, and transient. Kim Hall, again, Things of Darkness. The African is too accidental and solitary to be given a historical statistic. Wow. Very, very powerful and reductionist type of phrases and terminology. And we're going to try and unpack this and unearth this type of rhetoric. Nabil Matar, Islam in Britain, again, a very, very good book and a very learned scholar. But he says the likelihood in Tudor or Stuart Britain of an Englishman or Scotsman meeting a Muslim were higher than that of meeting a sub-Saharan African. Well, Mr. Nabil Matar, I think you've got your history wrong, my friend. But we'll have a look at that going forward. So, what do we know? We know that Alfred J. Church, very, very good book, number of different editions, but specifically in the 1896 edition, book called Early Britain, he said that the island, meaning this island, the British Isles, was inhabited probably at this time or certainly afterwards when we reached the historical period by different races of men. So he's saying that this country, this island, has been and was inhabited by different races of men. So not just one homogeneous race. Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, and we'll look at Romans shortly, he says that there were two, or he speaks of two different types of people. One called the Silures, okay? And they had apparently very dark complexions and for the most part curly hair. He says there was another group of people who resembled the Gauls, which were a Germanic tribe from Europe, and they had red hair and tall structure. So Tacitus is saying there's two types of people. which and he goes into a bit more description than Alfred J. Church. And it's bare, we should note that Tacitus writ this about 1,000 years, 1,500 years before Alfred J. Church. So there's a continuation of a narrative here, just like there was a continuation of the kind of reductionist narrative of the scholars. There's a continuation of another narrative that seems to suggest something quite different. Interesting. Okay, so Samuel Lang, who was an English MP, very learned person, he wrote a book called The Prehistoric Remains of Caithness. That was written in 1866. He was, a part of that was an anthropological appendix called Notes on the Human Remains. And Thomas Huxley wrote that apparently there was, in prehistoric Britain, there was savagery and it was barbaric and there was savagery. And eventually there was a group of people who, from some phenomenon from without or within, this is his words, became enlightened, and they started to build things like the Stonehenge, bury their dead in sophisticated ways, and get to a level of sophistication in society. But he says they present more of a resemblance to the lowest Australian than to the historical European race. So what he's saying there, when he mentions the lowest Australian, he's talking about the Aboriginal Australians. He's not talking about the settler Australians who came from England. He's talking about the Aboriginal Australians. Alternative narratives, redefining narratives. Open our minds. Okay. Next slide. Cheddar Man. Who's heard about Cheddar Man? No? Yeah, you have heard? You? Yeah, perfect. Anyone on screen who's heard about Cheddar Man? If you have, just put a thumbs up. If you haven't, put a thumbs down. Okay. Melissa, Agricole, shout out to you. Someone else as well, shout out to you. I can't see your name. But yeah, Timothy, lovely stuff. Perfect. Cool. So Cheddar Man. Cheddar Man was apparently lived around 10,000 years ago, and he's the oldest complete skeleton of our species, Homo sapiens, ever found in Britain. He's the oldest, right? So he was found, I think it was around 1903 or 1908. And in the 2018, the scientists at UCL, the Natural History Museum, and DNA specialists analyzed his DNA and made a model of what he would have looked like, or what they think he looked like based on his DNA. And these are learned people. It's not you and me coming together and trying to analyze DNA. These are people that do this for a living. This is their job, okay? And this is what they said that he looked like, okay? The results indicate that Cheddar Man had blue eyes and dark colored hair and dark to black skin pigmentation. Dr. Tom Booth, who's a very, very famous researcher, he works with the Natural History Museum. Don't know why it says Nation History Museum. It should say Natural History Museum. There, typo, apologies for that. He says that he's just one person, but he's indicative of a population of Europe at that time. Tom Booth then goes on to say that they had dark skin and most of them pale-colored eyes, either blue or green or dark hair. So Cheddar Man is supposed to be, there was supposed to be two groups of these people as well, again. And he's supposed to be formed one of this group called the Western Hunter-Gatherers. We have another person called the Loboch Man, who was discovered in Luxembourg, and another person called Labrana, who was discovered in sort of the Iberian Peninsula. And they're supposed to have very, very similar kind of DNA to Cheddar Man. Okay, this population forms around 10% on average of the ancestry of Britons, and its discovery is consistent, as I said, with a number of other human remains discovered throughout Europe. So this Cheddar Man, his remains and his DNA and the way he looked, is not just isolated. It's symptomatic of other people, of other groups of people, very, very similar across the whole of Europe. So we shouldn't look at Cheddar Man and think he's accidental, or think he's a solitary or a strolling player or the other. He is, people that look like him, Tom Booth is saying, would have been common across Europe at this time. What else do we know? We know about Septimus Severus. Who's heard about Septimus Severus? I'm sure some people have. No, no, no. Okay. So more people have heard about Cheddar Man than Septimus Severus. Okay, cool. So Septimus Severus was a Roman emperor, and he's said to have been from modern day Libya. Obviously, we know the Roman Empire spread from, you know, at one point from the UK, just under Scotland, right the way to the Middle East. Huge empire, massive empire. He's said to be one of the emperors at a particular period of time, 145 to 211. That's when he was born. And this is what he's said to have looked like. Okay, this is a painting, one of the oldest portraits. It's a classical portrait. I think it was painted around the year 250 AD. Okay, this is what he was said. No, sorry, 200 AD. This is what he was said to have looked like. Okay, there has been um, a lot of questions from historians about his specific race, the pigmentation of his skin, who he was, etc. But what we do know is he was from North Africa, Libya, at this particular period of time, and we do have these images of him. Here is his wife and his two children. One of their faces has been scratched out. We think that the other son done it. That's what historians think the other son's done it during a period of civil war between the two of them. But this is what they look like. This is what he said to have looked like. The Iron Bangle lady. So during this time, we have found, or historians have found, a number of skeletons, a number of bones, a number of remains of a number of people. When these remains and bones had been found, when we radiocarbonate them and do DNA analysis, we can tell things. We can tell where they're from. We can tell the age. We can tell what regions, and we can tell some other things as well. But this was another person, slightly later, obviously, than Cheddar Man, about 8,000 years later. But this is another person called the Iron Bangle lady. She was found in York under a sycamore tree. I think it was in 1903. When she was found, these were the items that were in her grave. Okay, silver, some precious materials, and some other type of materials, glass, etc. These items are indicative of her status. So what we know is that she was probably a person of high status, maybe someone in the aristocracy, but someone who had considerable amount of wealth to be buried with her items. Okay, so this is indicative of changing that narrative and that theory that black people that were here before slavery were only slaves. This person who was from, they say, is from sub-Saharan African descent, and this is the image of her. I think they said sub-Saharan and North African descent, biracial potentially, and these are her images. So it kind of really starts to question and challenge that notion and those notions that I raised earlier, that have been widely held with respect to black people in the UK. The Beachy Head Lady. So the Beachy Head Lady is another similar type of situation. The Beachy Head Lady was apparently she lived during the Roman period around 125 to 245 AD. Young woman, only 22 to 25 when she died. We don't know how she died, but we know that she lived around East Sussex, and we know again she was from sort of the North African or Sub-Saharan African region. Again, potentially biracial. That's what we do know about the Beachy Head Lady. The Aurelian Moors. The Aurelian Moors were, again, this term Moor. Okay, again, we're using this term Moor to denote people from African descent, from the continent of Africa. So the Aurelian Moors came to the UK, and they were based in a Cumbrian village called Bur by Sands, near the western edge of Hadrian's Wall during the 3rd century AD. So we know that there were a group of Moors, about a 500 person strong unit, and they were set up essentially to man the fort, a fort near Hadrian's Wall. We also know of other groups of Moors or other units of Moors that were around sort of the Essex region, that were a lot further south. And so we know about these, and these are written about and documented. We know about some of these units of all black soldiers. There were also other black soldiers, officers, and slaves during this particular period. There's been a number of excavations that have taken place, and yeah, archaeologists have suggested that several of these people could have been of African origin. So, early black presence in England. Um, so, black people from North Africa came with the Celts. They also was known to have come with the Vandals from North Africa. And we know that there were black people potentially among the Vikings and Danish raiders from around 700 CE. And we know this, again, because of remains found in a Viking grave. When analysis has been done of these bones and these remains, they're said to be people from sub-Saharan Africa. So let's fast forward slightly to the early modern period, which is a period from 1066, Battle of Hastings. I'm sure we all remember the Battle of Hastings from school. I know I do. That was something that was drilled in my mind. I'll never forget it. So 1066 to 1603. The Ipswich Man. Again, another skeleton found has come from, this time it's come from a medieval Christian cemetery in Ipswich. He was said to have been born sometime between 1119 and 1300 in Africa. This is his facial reconstruction. And 9 other skeletons was also found in the same cemetery. And these people seem to have come from sub-Saharan Africa. So again, more remains being unearthed to challenge a notion, a narrative that has been so long pushed in society with respect to the presence of black people in the UK. So there's a Tudor presence, a black Tudor presence, and we know a lot more about this presence than potentially we do about the other periods of time, potentially because it's closer to us, and potentially because this was a period of time that we have a lot of records. We have more records than previously. We have about 360 baptism, burials, and records that show people of African descent or black people in Tudor England in a number of places. So we shouldn't be naive to think that they were only in London or all in London. Obviously, London now has the largest majority of black people in the UK, followed by Birmingham, followed by Manchester. But in Tudor period, it was very, very different. The first place was London, places around Stepney, Southwark, Cheapside, and Aldgate. I was going to say Aldgate. The second place is Plymouth. The third place, Bristol. We also know there was a number of other places, smaller towns, smaller villages. Cambridgeshire being one of them. Also Somerset and Southwark. In David Dabberdine's Oxford Companion of Black British History, he estimates in 1601 there was a population around 15 to 20,000 black people in the UK out of a population of 3.4 million, which would have been a sizable minority at that time, similar to the minority at this time. Although some historians do question, David David Dabberdine's figures, but one of the things that they do all agree on is that people of African descent would have been at this time still had a significant presence. So these are some of the people we know of. We know, as I said, there are many, many, many records, but these are some of the people that we know who had a lot more of a description in the records. I'm going to look at a person called Mary Phyllis, and there are 2 other people I'm going to look at on the next slide, kind of trying to stay into the theme of this year's Black History Month, which is celebrating our sisters. I think a lot of the time with history, doesn't matter what type of history, it is dominated by male figures. It's dominated by male kings, male princes, male generals, and the lack of female agency runs very, very rampant through history. And I think for the purposes of this presentation, but also Black History Month, we want to really focus on that female agency with that throughout history. So Mary Phyllis, the daughter of Phyllis of Morisco, she was a Moroccan basket weaver and shovel maker. She came to London in 1584 supposedly when she was very young. She became a servant to a merchant and later worked for a seamstress in East Smithfield. Sorry. Okay. We know about someone called Catalina de Cardons. She was apparently Catherine of Aragon's lady in waiting. Okay, when Catherine of Aragon came to the UK, she came to marry Henry VIII. When she came from Spain. Spain at that time had just the Spanish reconquest of 1492 had happened, and Spain had retaken lands from the Moors, from the Moorish kingdoms. Because of that, there were a number of other diverse people who came with Catherine of Aragon at this time, and one of those was apparently Catalina de Cardons, supposedly a Moor. We know Catalina got married to another Moor called Oviedo, and we know that she was, one of Catherine of Aragon's close people in her entourage. We also know about Catalina of Gloucestershire, who was apparently an unmarried woman. She lived in Almondsbury, Gloucestershire, and she owned a valuable cow. And this cow was able to provide her with milk, butter, which was an income, which allowed her to be free, which allowed her to be independent. And at this time, it's comparative to now, obviously, it's different. But at that time, that would have allowed her to have a level of freedom of movement, of thought, of living in a period of time where that could have been quite different, especially being unmarried at that particular period of time. Next slide. So we're going to look at John Blank very, very briefly. John Blank was a royal trumpeter in King Henry VIII's court. John Blank, very famous person. He was on this is called the Westminster Tournament Roll, which was massive, pompous celebrations that was put on by King Henry VIII in 1511 to celebrate the birth of his son with Catherine of Aragon. We know that John Blank was paid 8 shillings per day by King Henry VIII. His annual wage was £12, and that was twice that of a farm labourer and 3 times that of a servant. We also know that John Blank petitioned King Henry VIII for a wage increase from 8 pence to 16 pence per day, and we know that this was granted, clearly showing that King Henry VIII valued his royal chief trumpeter. We know that he was also married. He got married potentially to an English woman at the time. We don't know her name, and that she was gifted a wedding, and he was gifted a wedding gift by King Henry VIII. Okay, fantastic image. Clearly shows his difference. Clearly shows that he was of African descent. He was a black man. He was a black royal trumpeter, and interestingly, he's wearing a turban, which could suggest that he wasn't Christian. A lot of the time in medieval and early modern Renaissance paintings in the UK, Moors are depicted as wearing a turban. Moors generally were Muslims. Those kinds of people. In 1596, Queen Elizabeth, she issued open letters. There were apparently 3 open letters to the Lord Mayor of London. What she basically said was that there are too many blackamoors that had been brought into this realm, her realm, Britain, and she wanted them to be deported from this country. Some earlier historians have said that this was the almost first attempt of a kind of immigration laws or immigration rhetoric. Some revisionist historians have said that these weren't laws and they didn't really do anything to change diversity in the UK, and only maybe 5 to 10 black people were taken out of England based on these laws or these letters, essentially. But what this does show and is indicative of the amount of black people that were here in the UK in the 16th century, so much so that Queen Elizabeth thought it to be suitable to write these letters. So the abolitionist movement. What do we know about the abolitionist movement? It was from a period of from 1783 to 1833. Okay, period of about 100 years. So we know that by mid 18th century, London had the largest African population, black population in Britain. majority of people living between Milan, Stepney, Paddington, St Giles. There's about 15 to 20,000 people. Okay, abolitionism was a movement in late 18th and early 19th century. It was founded by English Quakers and a few other evangelical religious groups that started condemning slavery, and it was influenced by new ideas at the time. It was a time of enlightenment where there was a time, and it was a time of people considering, divine damnation, really considering the concept of God, really considering the concept of the next life, the hereafter, etc. So these were the kind of ideas that were starting to be considered. Also, the ideas of freedoms, the ideas of justice, and all these other kind of Enlightenment era ideas. And these were ideas that started to have, groups like the Quakers started to really challenge whether slavery was actually moral and slavery was actually something that the English supposed Christians should be practicing. There were also other factors, though. It wasn't just moral or Enlightenment era factors or religious factors. There were obviously geopolitical factors and economic factors. There was also a moral dimension that opposed slavery, but not from a religious perspective, but more from a strategic perspective. And we'll go into that shortly later. One thing that we need to understand about the abolitionist movement is that it should be looked at within a wider global context. So what was happening at that time? What was happening at the time was the Haitian Revolution, which was in 1791 to 1804. This challenged the legitimacy of slavery and colonial rule. It led to an increased sympathy for the abolitionist cause, and the Haitian Revolution is denoted as being one of the, if not the most instrumental things that had happened in respect to changing slavery. It forced the Haitian Revolution was against a very important person called Toussaint Louverture. He fought Napoleon and won. And Haiti is supposed to have been the first black majority country in the Western Hemisphere, not just in the Western Hemisphere, in the world at that time, to have its freedom. We also know about other rebellions or wars in British Jamaica and British Barbados and other territories. We know about Tacky's War, which is another massive slave rebellion. We know about a number of other rebellions in 1795, Barbados in 1816, but probably the most important and substantial one was called the Baptist War or the Christmas Rebellion. And this was where there was apparently 60,000 slaves rose up in Jamaica and basically was very, very close of doing the same thing in Haiti and having a Haitian revolution in Jamaica, but it didn't quite happen. So that's kind of what was happening in a global context. As I mentioned, there was this issue, these wars between and and France at the time, and they both sought to gauge and to get the moral high ground over each other when it came to global dominance. As I said, we had an issue around the Enlightenment or the situation around the Enlightenment era. Things were changing, ideas started to change, and England and France wanted to be the kind of front runners of a change in morality, and the people who could uh, abolish slavery first would have that monopoly in moral authority, and that led to in 1807 we had the decline or the abolition of the slave trade, and then we had the abolition of slavery in 1833. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished, but that was only the slave trade being abolished. Slavery was still running rampant and was still common in the colonies. It was only until 1833 that slavery was abolished completely. So these are some of the usual familiar players when we look at the abolitionist movement: Olaudah Equiano, etc., Ignacio Sancho, top right hand corner. But for the purposes of Black History Month and the theme, I'm going to focus on Mary Prince, who usually doesn't get her stripes when it comes to the abolitionist movement. It's usually, obviously, as history is, it's usually focused on men, people like Olaudah Equiano, but we know that Mary Prince was just as, if not more, important than people like Olaudah Equiano. And the reason why is that I mean, they all wrote their own autobiographies and their own books, and they were all used, but her one was very, very different. Her one gave specific anecdotes and a specific analysis on what it was like to be a female slave, a woman slave at this particular period of time. Obviously, experiences were different, but she was the first person to give those experiences, and her experiences were used by the Quakers, William Wilberforce, and loads of other people within the abolitionist movement to really try and galvanize this abolition support. It shed light to the brutal realities of what it was like to be a female slave at this particular time. So salute to Mary Prince. Victorian era and the World Wars. So these are some of the familiar faces when it comes to the Victorian era. Obviously, when we think of the Victorian era, we don't think of these faces, but these are some of the faces we know. We know of Walter Tull, top left-hand corner, who was the first black football player. He also, served in World War One. Top left, bottom left-hand corner, Harold Moody, who was a scientist and a doctor at this particular period of time. These are just some of the faces of some of the people that usually don't get their stripes when we think about the Victorian era. One very, very important person is Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole was born in 1805 in Jamaica. She was a pioneering nurse who was very substantial and very important in the Crimean War. She traveled there in 1850 and set up something called the British Hotel, which was a makeshift hospital just below or behind enemy lines, behind the front line. She earned the name Mother Seacole and was very, very well respected. What's quite interesting about her is her unique approach to healing and to health. She was able to blend traditional Caribbean and African herbal remedies with European medicine, and that saved numerous lives. One of the things that has been quite sad is that Florence Nightingale has usually been remembered as opposed to Mary Seacole. So moving quickly into the post-World War II and the Windrush generation. Windrush and the British Nationality Act. So after World War II, there had been a labour shortage. We know that this labour shortage was obviously due to the war, but we know that there was a preference for European workers over workers from the British Empire, and this was evident due to government policies. There were things that was said that people from the colonies were unsuitable for work. And in 1948, George Isaacs and the Minister of Labour opposed encouraging further immigration. And we'll see how later on how some of these immigration or migrations were stopped or attempted to be stopped. In June 11, Labour MPs wrote to the Prime Minister Clement Attlee with concerns about immigration.